The morning my banking app flashed, "Access denied," I figured it had to be a glitch. I closed the app, restarted my phone, even reset my password. Nothing changed. Every attempt ended with the same cold message staring back at me. My name is Blythe, and until that morning I believed my life was finally settling into place. My grandfather had spent years planning for my future, and I had never questioned that everything connected to my trust was safe. After several failed login attempts, I drove to the bank hoping someone could clear up what seemed like a simple technical problem. The teller greeted me politely, asked for my identification, and typed quietly for several moments. Her calm expression slowly disappeared. She refreshed her screen twice before excusing herself. A minute later, she returned with an apologetic smile and said she couldn't explain what she was seeing. Instead, she asked if I would mind speaking with the branch manager. When the manager stepped into the lobby, she looked at me for a long second before saying my name. I was surprised because we'd never actually met. She introduced herself and explained that she had been working at the branch 10 years earlier, the day my grandfather finalized the trust that would one day become mine. She remembered him clearly and said he had insisted every detail be handled with extraordinary care. Without another word, she led me into her private office and quietly closed the door behind us. Her expression wasn't the look of someone dealing with a password problem. She folded her hands on the desk, took a slow breath, and said, "Blythe, I don't believe this is a banking error. I'm afraid the records suggest someone may have tried to take control of your trust, and the names involved are your parents." I stared at the manager, waiting for her to tell me there had been a mistake. Instead, she opened a folder on her desk and looked directly at me. "Blythe, I need to ask you something important," she said. "Have you signed any power of attorney documents recently that would allow someone else to manage your trust?" The question caught me completely off guard. "No," I answered without hesitation. "I've never signed anything like that. No one has ever asked me to." She gave a slow nod, as though my response confirmed a fear she already had. Turning the monitor slightly toward me, she pointed to a scanned document in the bank's records. Across the top were the words "Power of Attorney." My parents' names appeared as the people authorized to act on my behalf. For a moment I couldn't process what I was seeing. "There has to be another explanation," I whispered. "My parents wouldn't do this." "I hope you're right," the manager replied calmly. "But according to these records, this document was accepted by the bank as valid. It was notarized and submitted with supporting identification. Everything about it looked official. There were signatures, stamps, dates, and approval notes. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed I had signed it myself." The manager wasn't ready to stop there. She opened another system and began reviewing older account activity. At first she searched the past few months, but then she paused. Her expression changed and she expanded the timeline further back. "That's odd," she murmured. She kept scrolling through archived notes, reading entries made by different employees over the years. Questions about account access appeared long before my trust had matured. Requests for clarification about withdrawal rules surfaced again and again. None of them had seemed unusual by themselves, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I watched her connect dates, internal comments, and customer inquiries that stretched back nearly a decade. Whatever had happened wasn't a sudden decision made a few weeks earlier. She finally looked up from the screen. "I don't think this started with that power of attorney," she said quietly. "I think that document was only the final move. If we're going to understand what happened, we need to go back to where this really began." The manager's words pulled me back 10 years to a week I had spent trying not to remember. My grandfather's funeral had filled the old church with people whose lives he had quietly touched. He believed promises mattered, and he planned everything with remarkable care. After the service, our family met with his attorney to review the documents he had left behind. I was still too young to understand why everyone became so serious when my name came up. The attorney explained that my grandfather had created a protected trust for me alone. It contained the savings he had built over a lifetime, and every instruction had been written in precise language. The money would remain untouched until I reached 25. Until then, no one could withdraw it, borrow against it, or redirect it for another purpose. I remember my father leaning forward almost immediately. "So, can her mother and I be listed as co-signers?" he asked. "Just in case she ever needs help." The attorney answered politely but firmly. "I'm sorry, but that's not possible. The trust belongs exclusively to Blythe." Your father made that decision very clear. My mother smiled as though the response didn't matter. She said they were only trying to protect me because I was still young. No one around the table questioned their intentions. Their concerns sounded reasonable, and the conversation quickly moved on to other parts of the estate. Looking back now, I realized that had been the first time they tested the boundaries. The bank had followed my grandfather's instructions exactly. The attorney had refused every request that conflicted with the trust. Nothing improper happened that day, yet my parents left the meeting knowing something valuable. They understood what the rules were, who had authority, and what obstacles stood between them and the money. Sitting in the manager's office years later, those memories no longer felt ordinary. What everyone had dismissed as cautious parenting now looked like careful reconnaissance. They hadn't argued or caused a scene because they didn't need to. They simply gathered information and waited. The forged paperwork had not created the scheme. It had only completed a plan that depended on one thing above all else: patience. The branch manager continued opening archived records, moving through years of notes left by different employees. Most were short summaries of routine conversations, but together they painted a timeline that neither of us could ignore. Every few months, someone had contacted the bank with another question about the trust. The wording changed, yet the subject remained the same: access, authority, restrictions, and future withdrawals. As I listened, memories I hadn't thought about in years began to return. Growing up, my parents always told me that money was too complicated for me to understand. Whenever I asked about savings or investments, my father would smile and say he would handle everything when the time came. I accepted that answer because I trusted him. When financial mail arrived at the house, he opened it first. If an advisor ever called, he insisted on returning the call himself. He said professionals preferred dealing with adults who understood legal matters. At the time it sounded reasonable. Now it felt very different. My mother reinforced the same message in quieter ways. She often reminded me that family should manage important decisions together. Whenever I showed interest in learning about finances, she would tell me there was no need to worry because my parents would always look after me. Instead of encouraging independence, she made dependence feel like love. The manager pointed to another internal note. Years earlier, someone had asked whether a beneficiary could grant another person authority before the trust matured. A later entry asked about identification requirements. Another focused on document verification. None of the questions violated any rules, so employees simply answered them and moved on. Seen individually, every conversation appeared ordinary. Curious relatives asked questions all the time. There was never enough to raise suspicion. But laid side by side across an entire decade, the pattern became unmistakable. Each inquiry built upon the last, gathering another piece of information, removing another obstacle, preparing for a moment that had always been part of the plan. A heavy silence settled over the office as I stared at the screen. The hardest truth wasn't that my parents had deceived the bank. It was realizing I had spent years believing their guidance was protection, when in reality I had been living inside a carefully constructed trap without ever recognizing it. The manager clicked into another section of the bank's archives and stopped at a date that immediately caught my attention. It was the week of my 25th birthday, the exact day my grandfather's trust officially became available to me. Until then, the account had remained protected by every safeguard he had arranged years earlier. Once I reached that birthday, the trust entered a new phase. I finally had the legal right to access what had always been intended for my future. I remembered celebrating quietly with my family. My parents had acted unusually cheerful, asking casual questions about my plans. At the time, I thought they were simply excited for me. Looking back, those conversations carried a different meaning. The manager opened another record. 3 days before my birthday, my father had called the bank. According to the employee's notes, he wanted general information about transfer limits and processing times for large withdrawals. Because he wasn't listed on the account, no confidential information was released, but the questions themselves had been documented. My stomach tightened. I suddenly remembered him asking similar questions at home. He had wondered aloud how long banks held large transfers and whether money could be moved in stages instead of all at once. I had barely listened because I assumed he was talking about his business. The manager continued reading. A second entry appeared only days later. Another employee had recorded a follow-up inquiry about authorization requirements after a trust reached maturity. The timing was too precise to ignore. She turned the monitor toward me so I could read every note for myself. There was no exaggeration, no opinion, only dates, employee initials and summaries written long before anyone suspected fraud. For the first time, I understood that whatever had happened hadn't begun after I tried to log into my account. It hadn't even started after my birthday. The groundwork had already been laid before I ever touched a single dollar of my inheritance. My parents hadn't been reacting to the trust becoming available. They had been preparing for that moment in advance. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of each new document. Every page answered one question while creating another. The evidence was no longer built on assumptions or fading memories. The bank's own records were becoming impossible to dismiss, one entry at a time. The branch manager requested additional files from the bank's fraud department. Within minutes, more records appeared on her screen than either of us had expected. She carefully arranged the documents in chronological order, determined to understand exactly how the account had been compromised. One file immediately stood out. It contained the power of attorney that had granted my parents authority over my trust. The manager enlarged the signature and placed it beside a copy of the signature card I had completed when I was a teenager while opening my first savings account. At first glance they looked nearly identical. Then she pointed to several details. The shape of certain letters matched my teenage handwriting perfectly, including mistakes I no longer made as an adult. My current signature had changed over the years, but the one on the power of attorney copied an older version almost stroke for stroke. They didn't imitate the person you are today, she said quietly. They copied the signature you used years ago. Another document raised even more questions. The notarization had taken place hundreds of miles from my parents' hometown, in a city I had never visited. There was no reason for me to have been there and no record that I had traveled anywhere near that location. The manager continued building the timeline. Every unusual phone call, every question about trust procedures, and every request for clarification fit together with remarkable precision. 10 years of seemingly harmless interactions suddenly formed a clear sequence leading to one document. Only days after that paperwork reached the bank, large transfers began leaving the trust. The total displayed on the screen made my heart feel strangely numb. Nearly $310,000 had already disappeared. I expected tears or anger, but neither came. I simply stared at the number, unable to fully absorb what it meant. The silence inside the office felt heavier than any emotional outburst could have been. The manager closed one folder but kept another beside her. "I need you to understand something," she said. "This investigation isn't finished. We've uncovered how the money left the account, but there's another piece of evidence we haven't examined yet. It may explain who coordinated everything." I took a slow breath, stood from my chair and picked up my keys. There was only one place I needed to go next. It was time to look my parents in the eye and ask them the questions they could no longer avoid. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than it ever had before. Every mile gave me another chance to turn around, but I kept going. I wasn't looking for an argument. I wanted one honest answer. Their front door opened before I even reached the porch. My father stood there with my mother just behind him. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. It was as if they had been expecting this visit ever since I walked into the bank that morning. "We should talk inside," my mother said quietly. I remained where I was. "I know about the power of attorney," I said. "I know someone forged my signature." For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then my father sighed heavily. "It wasn't meant to hurt you," he said. "We were trying to protect your inheritance." The explanation only deepened my disbelief. "Protect it?" I asked. "By taking control of it without my permission?" My mother stepped forward and insisted everything had been done with good intentions. She claimed they had always planned to manage the money responsibly until I was ready to handle it myself. But the story quickly began to unravel. When I mentioned the missing transfers, my father's confidence disappeared. He admitted his business had been struggling for years. Contracts had fallen through, bills had piled up, and creditors were demanding payment. He convinced himself that borrowing from the trust would keep everything afloat long enough to recover. "We were going to put it back," he said. "Every dollar." I looked at both of them, searching for the parents I thought I knew. "If you had told me the truth," I replied, "I would have listened. We could have found another way." Neither of them answered. That silence revealed more than any confession. The money wasn't what hurt the most. It was realizing they had chosen deception over trust, believing forged documents were easier than an honest conversation with their own daughter. I stepped away from the doorway without raising my voice. There was nothing left to argue about. Some decisions permanently change a family, and this was one of them. As I walked back to my car, my phone vibrated with a message from the branch manager. "We found one more document," it read. "I think it's the final piece we've been missing." I returned to the bank the following morning. The branch manager was already waiting with a thick file on the conference table. She explained that the fraud department had finished collecting every internal record connected to my trust. Nothing had been left out. "This is the complete activity history," she said. "Every call, every inquiry, every note an employee entered over the last 10 years. We began reading through the file together. The earliest entries seemed harmless, but the pattern became clearer with every page. My father repeatedly contacted the bank under different pretexts, asking detailed questions about account procedures. He wanted to know what documents were required for changes in authority, how verification worked, and whether certain forms could be accepted if they were signed before a trust officially matured. One note stopped me cold. According to the employee's summary, he had even asked a hypothetical question about whether a power of attorney could be backdated if it reflected an earlier agreement. The bank representative had refused to discuss anything that violated policy, but the question itself had been documented. My mother had taken a different approach. Instead of focusing on access, she asked about the conditions that controlled when I could receive the inheritance. She wanted clarification about possible delays, exceptions, and administrative holds. Individually, her questions sounded practical. Together, they revealed someone searching for every possible obstacle between me and my own trust. The manager turned to another section of the report. Several months before I lost access to my account, the fraud department had quietly flagged unusual activity. Certain transactions and newly submitted documents didn't fit the account's normal history. An internal review had been recommended. "So why wasn't it stopped?" I asked. She lowered her eyes before answering. "An administrative failure delayed the review. The paperwork was processed before the warning received the attention it deserved." Her apology was genuine. She accepted responsibility for the bank's mistake without trying to excuse it. By then, the truth had become impossible to deny. This wasn't a desperate decision made in a single moment. It was a carefully planned effort that unfolded over years, supported by patience and deception. I closed the file and stood up. "This can't stay a private family matter anymore," I said. "It's time to let the law handle what happens next." 2 days later, I met with an attorney who specialized in financial fraud and trust disputes. Before I finished explaining everything, she asked to see the bank's records. She spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents without interrupting. When she finally looked up, her expression was calm but certain. "You've brought me more than suspicions," she said. "You have evidence." That afternoon, she contacted the bank's legal department and requested that every remaining asset connected to my trust be frozen until the investigation was complete. The request was approved quickly, preventing any additional money from leaving the account. The next step was filing a formal police report. Walking into the station wasn't easy, but I knew there was no other choice. I wasn't reporting strangers. I was reporting my own parents. Within weeks, investigators began tracing the missing funds. Financial records revealed that much of the money had been transferred into my father's struggling business. Large payments had covered overdue loans, operating expenses, and mounting debts. The inheritance that my grandfather had protected for my future had quietly been used to keep the company alive. Then an unexpected phone call changed everything. My younger brother asked if we could meet. He admitted he had recently discovered old files while cleaning out a storage cabinet in our parents' house. Among them were handwritten notes, printed emails, and draft documents discussing the trust years before the forged power of attorney appeared. The dates matched the timeline the bank had uncovered, strengthening the evidence that the plan had been developing for a long time. Investigators added the newly discovered material to the case. Combined with the banking records, it helped recover a significant portion of the missing money before it disappeared completely. Eventually, prosecutors filed criminal fraud charges against both of my parents. Friends asked whether I planned to attend the court hearings, but I declined. I had already heard every explanation they could offer. Sitting in a courtroom wouldn't give me back the trust that had been broken. Instead, I focused on building something new. I found my own apartment, made financial decisions without anyone speaking for me, and slowly regained confidence. My future would no longer be defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I chose to build from that point forward. Months after the investigation ended, my life settled into a rhythm I had once believed was impossible. I rented a quiet apartment, handled every financial decision myself, and discovered how reassuring it felt to rely on my own judgment. Each bill I paid and every choice I made reminded me that my future was finally in my own hands. The bank strengthened the security on all of my accounts. Identity checks became more thorough, large transactions required additional approval, and instant notifications were activated for every important change. Those protections couldn't rewrite the past, but they gave me confidence that no one would ever gain control of my finances without my knowledge again. My parents remained absent from my life. They tried reaching out more than once, hoping time would soften what had happened. I chose not to respond. Some actions leave consequences that cannot be erased with apologies alone. Peace became easier to protect once I stopped expecting the relationship to return to what it had been. My younger brother stayed in touch. His willingness to tell the truth during the investigation meant more than he probably realized. We built a new relationship based on honesty instead of obligation, and that became one of the few good things to come from everything that happened. I also found myself thinking often about my grandfather. His trust wasn't simply a financial gift. It reflected his understanding that real security comes from careful planning and strong principles. Even though others tried to misuse what he created, his foresight ultimately exposed the deception and helped preserve my future. Before closing that chapter, I visited the branch manager to thank her in person. She treated my concerns with patience, followed every lead, and refused to dismiss details that others might have overlooked. Without her determination, the truth may never have come to light. This experience taught me that betrayal doesn't always arrive through dramatic confrontations. It can develop quietly through small choices that seem harmless until they finally connect into a much larger picture. Although I recovered much of my inheritance, the greatest victory was reclaiming my independence, confidence, and peace of mind. If this story made you think, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what part stayed with you the most. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.